Hello, everybody. As Corey said, I am Emily. It's fun to have two of us in a group.
Not the
I
first
had a
time.
moment. Oh, I got muted. There we go. It happens so frequently now in my life. It's kind of interesting. But yes, I wanted to start by acknowledging that myself and members of this group are located on a chunk of Turtle Island referred to as British Columbia, and some of us are specifically, in myself included, the traditional territories of the Esquimalt and Lekwungen people. Want to remind everyone that this land has been stolen, and that we acknowledge and thank the Indigenous people and First Nation communities across this land for allowing us to live, work, and play. It's general announcements. Healthy Voices is ongoing, with the next session happening on January 13th at 7 p.m. As well as we have Tennille Gieb, our resident therapist, and Rebecca, our elder, who are available to provide support if anyone is looking to or needing some additional support today. Please just drop a note in the chat and we will make sure that you are connected with either of them. All right, in regards to some general housekeeping, as a reminder, if you're wanting to enter to win the HBO Max subscription, please make sure you have RSVP'd on the website. We'll be actually doing the drawing for the winner on December 30th at the beginning of the final panel. Just for your own comfort, please feel free to have your video on or off. You can change your name to include your pronouns by right-clicking on your image, thumbnail, or the video of you, and that will give you that option. Nicola will be our chat moderator for today. She will keep you muted while the conversation is going. There will be a question and answer period. If you would like to ask a question, type question and then type out your question. Nicola will then pass that on to our host and our producer. Our tech person today is Christy. And if you have any tech questions, please type tech and then whatever your tech issue is into the chat. Today we have Rebecca, who will be, Rebecca, who is also providing cultural and emotional support. All right. If you are needing someone to talk to, just send a private message to Christy and she will move you over to the proper breakout room. I'm going to pass over now to our lovely host and producer, Corey, who will introduce herself.
Sure. Actually, before that, does Rebecca want to say a little bit about herself?
Sure, I would love to. Anine, Gizap, good afternoon, my beautiful souls on the call today. I'm so grateful. My name is Rebecca Hay, and I'm from Curve Lake First Nation. I'm Anishinaabe. Curve Lake is by Toronto. That's where my people are from. But I presently live on Lekwungen land in Victoria. I followed my beautiful children here when they got all grown up. I couldn't be away from them. And I'm so happy to be here if anybody wants to have a little visit or a little chat. I love chatting, and I'm so grateful and blessed to be in your presence today. I'm so grateful to be on this call for the last couple of weeks, and thank you so much for having me. Much love, much blessings, all my relations.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Tennille, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Hello, folks. My name is Tennille, and I am here for extra support today. My role at Rainbow Health is a couple roles, but in today's session. I can also be in a room with Rebecca if you want more support from us, or if there's multiple people needing support, we can take on a different breakout room. And just, I think what I'll say here is when we go through discussions like this, they can be creative and wonderful, but they can also be sometimes hard. And that's okay. And maybe just having compassion with yourself and others through this experience is the invite I have for today. So thank you so much. And I look forward to experiencing this with you all.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm so grateful that you're able to be here and provide that service for folks, because you never know. And so, and just as because Chris might be popping in and out, I just want to also add that if you do want to connect with Rebecca or Neil in the wellness room or another room, another option is also send a message to Nicola, and Nicola will pass you over. So there's a couple options, because sometimes you never know, things can be happening and someone may not see a message or wherever. So it's good to have a couple options for folks. So with saying that, a little bit about me, I won't go into too much detail. I know there's new humans on the call today, so I will say my full spiel. So I'm originally from Alberta. So if anybody knows Alberta, it is adventures, we'll put it that way. And I have a Bachelor of Social Work, a counseling diploma, and a Master's of Education. So in my weird world, I put it all together and have lots of fun in all the creative things that I do. I have a private practice where I do consulting, counseling, workshops, whether that's LGBTQ related stuff, whether it is mindfulness, healthy relationships, sexuality in general, all of that fun stuff. And then through Rainbow Health, God, I've had so many hats with Rainbow Health and Ochi T-Vine, depending on the word you want to use. I think in the next little while, we'll probably be tossing out Rainbow Health as a term, but just in case you've heard multiple words, just so you know, it's all in the same sphere. And so I've done everything from the Friday night sex shows to putting on the T-Door, whole bunch of stuff. So, and my role is going to be changing again here a little bit. And so I think I'll leave it at that. And I'm really excited to be introducing our panelists for today. The third panelist, I'm not seeing our third panelist yet, but we do have our two amazing panelists. And I'm going to have maybe Marcus, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe do your little introduction if you've got one?
Sure. So my name is Marcus Arana. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm a transgender activist living in the Bay Area of California. I'm a former discrimination investigator with the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, where I enforced gender identity law, did a lot of law and policy work around transgender health benefits, and reporting on medical abuses against people with intersex. I had to retire 10 years ago disabled, and since then I've stayed pretty busy. I am Blackfeet on my father's side and Scottish and Irish. I am Indigenous Mexican and Ama Mutsunaloni on my mother's side, as well as Scottish. So there's a lot of Scottish in there and a lot of Indigenous. I'm very active in the Two-Spirit communities. That's actually where Corey and I met, was at a gathering in BC 10 years ago, hard to believe. And my current activities include doing Indigenous outreach on behalf of the National Center for Trans Equality here in the US, where we're working to field a national survey and we're trying to up Indigenous participation. And I'm also on the powwow committee for Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. And after a year of COVID and having to be virtual, we're returning to our in-person powwows. This is the 11th annual Two-Spirit powwow to be held by the Bates people. And this year it's in San Francisco. So we're very excited. That's coming up on February 12th. So that's a little bit about me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marcus. Emily.
Hi. See, I prepared a whole thing, and I can cut it. But briefly about me, my name is Reverend Emily Cook. I live and work on the traditional unceded and stolen territory of Kamloops Tishoquamuk, normally known by its colonizer name of Kamloops, British Columbia. I am an ordained minister of the United Church of Canada. Have been since 2016. I have a Bachelor of Arts in English and Creative Writing from York University and a Master of Divinity from Emmanuel College of the University of Toronto. And I have a husband and I have two adorable fur babies who are sleeping over there. And I am trans. I am a binary trans woman. Briefly about me, this is something I realized only this past year. COVID broke me, as I think it did a lot of people. Basically, one day I woke up and my brain said, hey, remember all that wanting to be a girl you did as a kid? What if we took that seriously? And honestly, since then, it's gone amazingly well for me. I am extremely lucky in who my family, who my friends, and who my church communities have shown themselves to be. And so I've been wonderfully supported in that, in my transition, legally, socially, medically. But as a Christian minister and a trans woman, I'm very acutely aware of an awful lot of trauma that religion has caused to the community. And I try to be very, very sensitive about that and aware that, you know, I'm here, I'm showing up in a collar, I have a cross around my neck. These are symbols of, to a lot of people, these are symbols of abuse, and I acknowledge that. But what draws sort of where I wanted to go for this, when I was asked about, when Corey and I have a mutual friend, Jane, who's actually a Lutheran pastor, and she put me in touch with her about this thing. And I just like had so many ideas explode in my head about, oh, I want to talk about the matrix and liberation theology. Liberation theology is sort of my jam. So a brief introduction about that. That's where I was going with this. Liberation theology now is a loose collection of the theologies of oppressed peoples. There is Black liberationist theology, there's feminist liberation theology, there's queer liberationist theology, there's Indigenous liberation theology, but its roots are in Latin America and in the socialist movement. And it was really defined by a book written by a Peruvian priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, A Theology of Liberation. At times it's been considered a heretical movement within the church. At least within the Catholic Church, JP2 and Benedict were not fans. Francis has been accused of being a liberationist by conservative Catholics, which I just think is kind of funny because I don't think Francis goes remotely far enough, but I kind of like the guy. I'm not Catholic, so I don't have to, I don't think he speaks infallibly. The basic foundation of liberation theology is that God works to liberate oppressed peoples. So that's the essence of the story that is found in the Bible, both in the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bible. What in the socialist context of Latin America in the 60s and 70s, what Gutierrez called God's preferential option for the poor, but extends to any people who are on the margins. Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer people, women, people with disabilities. I should have mentioned that there's a strong strain of disability liberation theology. The liberation in Christian theology, the liberation narrative is born out and completed by the story of Christ. Birth, life, death, and resurrection are part of God's liberation for the oppressed. Christ is an expression of God's solidarity with the poor and oppressed. Jesus was a poor man of a colonized people, and that's who the Savior of humanity is, the incarnation of the divine word. Liberation theology, in contrast to what I think a lot of people might be exposed to in Christianity in North America, particularly, a hyper-individualist Christianity that focuses on individual salvation. Jesus died for your sins, and it's only your personal liberation from your sin that is at stake here. In The Matrix, I found this really interesting tension in the second and third movies about, those who just are happy with their own individual liberation from the Matrix and just want to go about living their lives, versus those who want to continue the struggle against the machines. So Morpheus versus the other leaders, Link in his conversations with his wife about why he needs to go out. In trans communities, you find this among people who are like, I just want to pass and live my life, and others who are like, trans liberation now. And then in Christianity, born again Christianity versus liberationist Christianity. So there's this tension between liberation definitely focuses on a collective liberation, and its heart and soul its roots are in socialist movements in Latin America. So it's not, it doesn't really carry much of like the Protestant work ethic, or that focus on, I'm just trying to get my soul out of hell. As a trans person and Christian, sort of like watching these movies, I was really struck at like the parallels between born again language and trans awakening language, and how they're both basically the same thing. Morpheus's speech to Neo, you know something is wrong, but you don't know what. You feel that, I definitely felt that as a trans person. Like most of my life, I thought I was a cis guy. And it took me a while for my brain to finally click, and it's like, oh, this is it. But a lot of evangelical Christianity, that born again strain of Christianity, will describe, the God-shaped hole in your heart. And it has a lot of parallels, and there's this sort of like awakening. And, if you listen to as much terrible contemporary Christian music as I do, there's that, my chains are gone, I'm liberated, sort of language there. Throughout these movies, like I see the symbolism of awakening paralleled with like the symbolism of baptism, Neo's awakening scene, an almost violent thing, which, you can compare to like the full immersion style of baptism. But like I latch onto liberation because to me, being trans is about feeling liberated. I put this in my coming out sermon to my churches. It's like, I, for the first time in my life, feel free. If not free to be who I am, at least free to finally discover who I am. And that, to me, that just sounds like, it feels like a come to God moment for me. And reading the Bible as a trans person is definitely a changed experience from reading it thinking I was a cis person. I read a word like Isaiah 43:1, I have called you by your name, you are mine. And suddenly I'm remembering all those times like I felt so overwhelmed when somebody called me Emily. When my husband started using that name, when the people around me, my family started using that name, it was powerful. But what I really wanted to look at when I was watching these movies, what first came to mind was like how, what does liberation mean for those who are on the side of the oppressor? And I had thought about that for liberation in theology for the long time, first mainly thinking I was a cis guy. And so I'm like, what does this mean to me? I still think about it in terms of I am white. I am of a colonizing people. I belong to a church that did run Indian residential schools and has to face the consequences of those in a search for reconciliation with our Indigenous family. What does that mean? What does it mean? What does liberation mean for the oppressor? Systems of oppression work best when they're sort of mimetic to somewhat tongue-in-cheek steal Dawkins' term, when they self-perpetuate. They don't require a lot of active maintenance by the oppressor. So we see this in the Matrix, how like the agents are this sort of like almost, they're only sent in when things are really bad. They're not out there everywhere maintaining the Matrix. Most people do that themselves. And it's why, you know, the bulk of the grunts in the first movie are cops. I don't think that's a mistake. I think that's very on the nose symbolism. But in the same way that patriarchy hurts men, cis heteronormativity and rigid gender roles hurt cis straight people, but the vast majority of men and cis het people will perpetuate the systems out of out of a sense of preservation. We tend to perpetuate these systems within ourselves, and then that can become more extreme. When Morpheus says to Neo, anyone can be an agent, like, what came up in my mind is like a very common experience for trans people that I've talked to, is something I worry about kind of constantly, is those times when there's active maintenance, like the experience of someone you thought might be an ally suddenly expressing a bigoted opinion and getting very defensive when called out, or a violent reaction to the revelation of being trans. And I've known people that have had that happen, or, you know, somebody you thought was smart falling down the turf rabbit hole, whether you know them personally or whether it's just an author you admired. That sort of anyone can suddenly, like on a dime, turn and become a very active part of the oppression. And you can never 100% be sure. So it does create this sort of paranoia, I think. But what was more interesting, and the last little bit was like, when people who are oppressed, when they sort of like experience a desire to stay in the oppression. I remember discussing the movies in a fourth year critical theory course in my undergrad. I think we were talking about a Zizek essay. I have it here. The Matrix Are Two Sides of Perversion by Slavoj Žižek. And the topic came up, what's so bad about the Matrix? Like, why wouldn't you want to stay in it? It's comfortable. Smith gives that speech to Morpheus about like how it's suffering, not paradise, that feels comfortable to humans. And I think that's true for a lot of things. When I deal with the imposter syndrome of being trans, which is an extremely common experience from everything I've read and people I've talked to, is like, no, I can't possibly be trans. What am I doing? It's that, well, how it felt before felt comfortable. It didn't feel good, but it felt comfortable, like a ratty old coat that didn't keep you warm, but was at least broken in. And part of my brain is saying, it's not normal to be happy with who you are. You must be doing something wrong. So we see like that there's that desire to even stay within the system of oppression. If it was just natural to try and escape it, so many more people would be doing it. And then you've got someone like Cypher, who can be compared to someone who detransitions, or a self-hating trans person, who is just like, or someone with an incredible amount of dysphoria for whom the realization, the finally coming to terms with all that was really, really hard. I am almost done. So, so the big question is like, what does liberation mean for the oppressor? It means liberation from being in the role of the oppressor, that likewise does tend to trap us. I feel you know, as a white Christian, I feel the weight of colonialism and the oppression of First Nations and Indigenous peoples here in North America on Turtle Island. The damage that was done through forced assimilation, particularly the residential schools. I live just down the road from the Kamloops Indian Residential School, where that first discovery was made back in May of the 215 children. I drive by that school every day. It's a sobering sight every morning. A need to be liberated from the role of being the oppressor and instead choosing to work on the side of the oppressed, like willingly surrendering privilege, willingly surrendering security to work on the side of the oppressed. I think we see this in people like the Oracle and those who work with her. And they're the foundation of peace, of the peace that Neo negotiates with the machines, rather than revenge and the movies ending with the destructions of the machines. It's because that there were certain people who were on the side of the machines who chose instead to work on the side of humanity. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about Smith, Smith is the most interesting character in all the movies to me. I think he represents a false liberation for the oppressor, which is nihilism. You see Smith's dialogues with Neo, particularly in the third movie, in that final climactic scene, you see nihilism versus, I think, real existentialism, which can be liberative. But Smith thinks, you know, when he is quote unquote liberated, when he's by Neo, he thinks he's above it all, but he's still very much subject to all the same rules. He thinks he's liberated in the same way Neo is, but he's still driven by those systems of oppression, of needing to control, and still placed on the side of the oppressor. He can't work for humanity's liberation. He has to destroy them. Smith's, you know what he struck me the most as being like in terms of the trans analogy is kind of like a chaser. You know, somebody who hates trans people but is obsessed with them, or potentially a self-hating trans person, or someone whose transphobia just sort of takes over their lives and becomes an obsession, and then they start tweeting on it like 20 times an hour. But Smith is like, he's this sort of like false liberation for the oppressor. And I think he's a very fantastic character, and Hugo Weaving is an amazing actor. I had no good ending for this bit, so that's it. And I think I'm well over 10 minutes. So thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. You went all over the map, which is awesome. And as we discussed when we had our little conversation before, because I lean mostly these days to Buddhism, and the liberation piece that you were talking about has its parallels with radical Dharma, which is about liberating and supporting queer and people of color within the Buddhist places and Dharma sanghas and those kind of things. So there's a lot of parallels. And the next panel, we do have a Buddhist speaker from the Meditation Center from San Francisco, but unfortunately they weren't able to make it today, but they are going to make it to the science panel, which should be an interesting conversation because we have a neurologist and a physicist. So that should be really a really neat and complex conversation. So with all of that, Marcus, out of what Emily has said, is there anything that sticks out in your mind that you want to comment on before I get into my questions?
Wow, there's so much that, I should have been taking notes because I was absolutely carried away by a beautiful presentation and a synopsis of some very difficult ideas into really understandable terms. So I appreciate that. There are a couple of things that stand out for me. I really appreciated the notion of liberation theology and the role of that and the importance of that. When I look at the Matrix, and I never thought about Cypher necessarily as an analog to a self-hating trans person, but it's true, the comfort of knowing that he really wasn't tasting that steak, really wasn't smelling that steak, but it was good enough for him. And for me, in what drove me to transition was the absolute inability to do that. The hum in the back of my head, like Neo had, where there was just something wrong all the time. It didn't feel right. There were glitches in my reality. And my reality got made right when I became who I am now, which is Marcus. So that's kind of one thing that leapt out at me. And my wife Nancy and I both watched this. I was raised Catholic, so I appreciate what you have to say about Catholic ideas. I'm a Native American traditionalist, so I pretty much dwell in that spiritual realm now. There was particularly in the second and absolutely in the third movie, what seemed to be a lot of Christian undertones. Neo is the chosen one. Neo sacrifices himself in the end, and even the death scene had him in a slightly crucified position with his arms out and his legs straight. I was like, is this really happening? And so, as somebody who is a survivor of my Christian experience, that was a little bit jarring for me. So I really respect what Reverend Emily had to say about owning the trauma that's carried in the practices sometimes, and the symbology, because really religions, and there's either something or nothing on the other side of this. And there are a lot of people who believe in nothing, and there's a lot of us who believe in something, and we have different ideas of what that something is. And none of us are really going to know until we get there. So it really is all about the belief. And that's what kept coming up over and over and over with Morpheus, with Trinity, with Niobe, who gave the ship up. This, I don't know, everything tells me that this is wrong, but I'm going with you because I believe that you're right. I trust that you're right. And if you are right, it's a much better thing we're headed towards than the status quo of fighting these beasts, these, engines all the time. I think that when you look at the symbology that flows down, what's interesting about that is computer programming is binary. It's zeros and ones. And yet the language of the Matrix transcended that and was far beyond zeros and ones. And so if I'm looking at transgender references in the movies, that to me was a beautifully expansive idea of what gender is. It's not just a 0 or a 1. Some of us are zeros, some of us are ones. We're binary, and there's a lot of us who aren't. So I always loved that flowing cascade in the background coming down. And in terms of oppressors giving up oppression, a place that I like to go to when I'm dealing with people who are stuck in their isms is Plato's analogy of the cave, wherein reality is us all in this cave together with our backs to the opening and a fire in front of us. And the only reality we see are these shadows that go on the wall in front of us that are carried by people who are just holding up a deer, holding up a tree. And that's all that we know that is reality. And so if that's your comfort zone, and that's all you know is reality, and one of us breaks free and we go out of that cave into the light, suddenly it's blinding. We can't even see. We can't even see ourselves. And we have to adjust. And I think Neo went through that initially. We have to adjust to this new reality, this new birth. And then you try and go back in the cave to save people. and tell them that what they thought was true wasn't true. And you get a lot of pushback. That power concedes nothing of itself was said long ago by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's not the patriarchy's not going to give it up. The capitalists are not going to give it up. And the only way that we can get them to give it up is to get them to realize they have to. And when you come out of the light back into that dark cave and you try to tell people you need to give up these practices, they're killing the planet. You're destroying our grandchildren's future. They think you're crazy because their reality is the gas pump. And, you know, and everything else that comes with that. So I think it's an interesting challenge that I don't know that we have the answers to yet about how do we get people to see the light, because that's where change happens.
Holy. So again, Marcus, that was awesome, and many different pieces to go off there. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is does it mean, and I think both of you talked about this in terms of your own language, is what does it mean to transcend or be liberated, right? And it has its own ways of being perceived. Marcus, from a Native American perspective, how, and of course, acknowledging that there's hundreds of nations and you can only speak from what you are aware of, but from your orientation, what does, you know, liberation, transcending, or an equivalent term mean for you and the people in your community?
Well, there's all sorts of liberations that we could talk about if we're looking at the Indian communities at large. And I say communities because we are not a monolithic group.
Yeah.
From north to south, it's about how do we get back our identities, our cultures, our languages, our songs, our dances, our land, and be honored and recognized as sovereign people in the face of the occupation that we're living with. So there's the actual political liberation, as it were. You know, by and large, I can't speak for all Indian theologies, but I can tell you from my own teaching, we tend to see Creator as a great mystery and beyond human comprehension. So nothing is written down. Everything comes through oral tradition. Everything comes through teaching and stories and songs and dance, etc. There is a pretty common thread that goes through all of this, and this circles back to liberation. And that is this notion that we're driven by spirit. And spirit is what dictates who we are and what we do, and how to be in a good way. And so if spirit tells me over and over and over that I'm Marcus and not Mary, who is anyone else to question that? And those people who haven't been tainted by modern society still remember when two-spirit people were honored in traditional cultures. So there's the modern movement of two spirits who are trying to return acceptance and being reincorporated and returning to community to people who have been taught for generations and hundreds of years that we're wrong, that we're evil, that we're ungodly. And, you know, they just forgot what they used to know. So a part of our mission is to help liberate them by reminding them of what they used to know. And that is that two-spirit people, trans people, non-binary people were always an important part of community as name givers and midwives and prayer people and war chiefs and healing people. So, you know, and just average everyday corn growers. Everybody had a part in community and nobody was expendable.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I know through the work I have done with a lot of Indigenous communities, one of the quotes that is often said to me that everyone belongs in the circle, and if anyone is missing, then the circle is broken, right? So, um, and something that both of you alluded to was the conversation of purpose, right? Marcus, you were talking about the internal sense of who I am, that sense, but also it alludes to what am I supposed to do in this life? Emily, can you comment a little bit more on that? Maybe a compare and contrast between the Matrix, but also how it relates to Christian theology.
Sure. For me, at any rate, being an ordained minister, but also just in general in Christianity, the sense of being called by God to something is extremely important. The idea of vocation, a sense of vocation, but that it's God who's specifically calling you towards this. And I would say I feel called by God to be a woman, or at present to be who I am, that God would rather be in relationship to me as I am and in truth, rather than who I was before. Being able to and being aware that as I'm doing this, I'm so much more able to be in relationship, not just with God, but with everyone, because now I can feel a full range of emotions. I feel more free to be myself, and not sort of put a lid on myself. So, and in that sense, and that sense of purpose, that this is who I'm meant to be, not just not just, you know, and not just for me, but for everyone around me and for God. In terms of the Matrix, I think it's like Neo, you know, he always felt that something was wrong, but he needed to be called, get a phone call from Morpheus. He needed to be awoken in some fashion. Don't know if that quite answers the question. But that sense of purpose, and that sense of that purpose ultimately being, I guess different Christian theologies will come up with different answers for the question of, like, why did God create us? What is the purpose of life? Within the doctrine of the United Church, actually, is a beautiful statement. God created us in love to love. That it's just part of God's nature, is just the love. And a love that is unconditional, but a love that requires everyone to be who they are, and not to be oppressed, and not to be self-oppressed, because otherwise the relationship isn't full.
Marcus, you look like you had something to add to that.
This is an amazing conversation, and I'm grateful to have Emily here, because our experiences are so similar and so very different. Yeah, I transitioned in 1994, and when I transitioned, I had been an out queer, a dyke, a lesbian, whatever you want to call me, since I was 15. So I've never known the inside of a closet. Never have known the inside of a closet. And it became very clear to me that a part of my purpose was to be visible, was to be out there. And I was bemoaning some fact of life at one point, and somebody looked at me and said, well, you can just pass. And I thought, pass as what? Pass as male? Pass as white? Pass as rich? I mean, which passing are you talking about? And I realized that there was an obligation, because of how I appear to people and the amount of deference that people would give a face like this. It became my obligation, my duty, my purpose to make sure that I used whatever privilege was given to me. After 37 years of being a second-class citizen for being female, after decades of being a second-class citizen for being queer, it was really important And after a lifetime of being a Native American person and a Mexican person, it became really important to become visible. So a conversation I had with somebody yesterday, they looked at me and they said, I just want to thank you because you are the only elder transmasculine Indigenous person I know. And that's meaningful to me. And I thought, wow, if I wasn't alive for any moment at all, that was a moment that I'm glad that I was here for. So when you dissect happiness, a part of happiness is purpose.
Beautiful, brilliant. So one of the interesting themes within the matrix that comes up is that we find out that the prophecy is a lie, right? Created by the machines. And so there is this sense of, okay, what is now Neo's true purpose versus what is the purpose that the machines are giving him, i.e. the oppressor. How do you then, what does that look like in our real world? And how do we differentiate between this fictional purpose versus our true purpose?
Well,
Emily.
yeah. I do want to say thank you, Marcus, because like, goddamn, do we need trans elders, and we need them to be visible. So I appreciate that. What stands out for me, and like the prophecy is a lie, it's another tool of control. Well, yeah, and as I said at the beginning, I acknowledge that I sort of live, breathe, and work within a system of control, within organized religion, that but I still hold on to it because I do believe it can be a vehicle for liberation. I think the story is powerful enough to do that. And I sort of see like Morpheus in the third movie, he still has faith in Neo. He still has a lot of faith when Neo's like, I got to go to the Machine City. It's like, it's not part of the prophecy. The Oracle said nothing about it, but he's just going to believe it. So even like taking what was just another system of control, but you can move beyond it. It can still be a vehicle for liberation, and ends up being that. That's what sort of struck me as like the parallels between that prophecy and you know, the Christian church. What was presents itself as liberative, way too often oppressive, but can in fact be liberative if looked at in the right way. That is how I feel about it, and it's why I still, you know, call myself a Christian and a minister.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a really good point, Emily, in that Christianity, if you actually look at what has been attributed to Jesus saying, has been greatly misinterpreted. I'm not sure how we got from the Sermon on the Mount to a contract with America, but it begs the question of what is real, because really, in essence, we live in these meat puppets that are limited by 5 senses. And even our 5 senses are somewhat feeble when we are compared to other animals. So, you know, I can look at a daisy, I can look at a sunflower, and I can see a certain thing, and a bee or a bird looks at it, and they see all of these colors that my eyes can't see. And so it just begs the question. We know that elephants communicate over hundreds of miles with tones that are so low in frequency, we can't hear them. And we only incidentally learned about this about 10 years ago when we were doing some recording work, and we went, oh my God, look at what elephants do. How long has this been going on? Well, since ever elephants have been alive. But the point is, our feeble little human senses don't pick that information up. So as these meat puppets, if all we perceive is through our senses, and that is the source of our reality, it's quite a dream. It's quite a dream. And I'm a person who believes in lucid dreaming. So if we are somehow, you know, the subjects of these senses, who's to say that I can't change the laws of gravity? Who's to say that I can't float a ball in the air or change what this matrix is like? Because truthfully, the matrix really made me question, what is reality? And who decides what is real? I think the only place I can ever escape to get out of that weird little rabbit hole is to go out into the wild and to get into nature again and to see how everything interacts so much larger than just my tiny little life that I'm ruminating about, which is why I have manta rays in the background, just to remind you that this is going on in the ocean as we speak. So, you know, what is life?
Yeah, I think one of the themes that struck me towards the end of the third movie is like get the idea of getting to choose your own reality. Like the piece Neo negotiates, and I guess the Oracle negotiates with the architect is, you know, those who want to get out. Those who want to stay. But it's choice, and that's also what, you know, Neo says to Smith during that, you know, he gets that one liner, "Why do you fight, Mr. Henderson?" "Because I choose to." And there is a sense that we get to choose our own reality. One of the things that that always struck me as a trans person when dealing with transphobia is like the notion that somebody else thinks that they know what's going on inside of my mind better than I do around my identity is just a bit staggering. So I get to define, I know which language is best for what I'm feeling. And likewise for people who express their gender very differently from me. And I've had arguments with quote unquote true scum about this, is like, what does it matter? You don't know what's going on in someone else's head better than they do. They get to choose. They get to define for themselves who they are. They get to choose their own reality.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So Emily, you spoke about choosing your reality at one level. Marcus was talking about a whole different level, that we are actually in a matrix, and maybe eventually we might be able to consciously be able to manipulate it. For you as an individual or a person in your faith, do you think that it is contradictory to your faith or somewhat involved? I know, for example, in Gnosticism, which is an old, mostly wiped out form of Christianity in the early part of Christianity, where they believe that an anti-God basically created the matrix, not created the matrix, but created humans and the world. And it was our purpose to realize that the anti-God in our world was not the real thing, and our bodies were basically sinful and negative, and to be liberated from that. And I know there's definitely some differences between Gnosticism, and there's variants with it even in Gnosticism. Well, how did you as a Christian perceive that?
It's a long, complicated history within the history of Christianity that basically boils down to a tension between Christianity's Jewish roots and its Hellenistic influences when it started spreading to the Greek-speaking world. Judaism, at least the Judaism of the time, is a very embodied religion and didn't really have this concept of like a detached soul. The resurrection that Jesus talks about a lot, your body would die, your body would be buried in the ground, and then at the end of days, God would raise up your body. Versus Greek ideas that brought in things like Platonic ideal forms and a lot of different like esoteric philosophies and theologies would influence Christianity as it spread. And early Christianity is this was like the Wild West of theology. Everybody trying to like assert their particular brand. It eventually coalesced into what we call Orthodox Christianity with the Nicene Creed. But throughout history, strains like various kinds of Gnosticism, Marcionism, which is also like what you described of the demiurge, through to the Middle Ages, Catharism or Albigenesism, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Basically really disliking the idea of the body, and particularly the idea Jesus had a body, and insisted that, no, this is only seeming. Jesus only seemed to be human, and we only seem to be human if we are saved. We only seem to have these bodies. We're encased in these meat bags that have all these disgusting bodily functions, and sometimes we look at it in the mirror and wonder why they're so covered in body hair and why you can't get rid of it. And that tension sort of comes and goes throughout Christian history about like a focus on the body as the source of being, or some immortal soul that is detached from the body. You even see this in different denominations, different strains of Christianity. Catholicism really puts a lot of emphasis on the body. You walk into any Catholic church and there is a body on the cross, as you get in a lot of evangelical churches, maybe a more, this is about your immortal soul who's going to go up to heaven and leave your body behind to turn into dust. So I think I was describing like choosing your own reality on like one level of the level in here, and Marcus may have been describing on a level out there. I don't think they're necessarily all that different.
Cool. Thank you so much. So one of the interesting things that is described in the movies is the cyclical nature, right? There's been multiple matrices, there's been multiple Neos, and we know that literally Neo is being reincarnated in a form in the last movie that's coming up. So allegory to reincarnation, but also this cyclical nature. And in many traditions, the Mayans, Eastern religions, things like that definitely include the sense of cyclical nature throughout human history, and definitely being longer than what we perceive. And there's some archaeological and anthropological research now that is definitely pointing in that direction. A long ways to go by any means. And so for you folks, where do you fit on the idea of death and rebirth, cyclical natures? Marcus.
Well, I personally believe in rebirth. I think that it would be a very odd thing if this were all it were, and that somehow there's this infinite number of souls that just are purposed once. And there's billions of planets and stars out there, so there's no telling how much of life exists far beyond this little tiny rock that we live on. And I want to acknowledge that as well. You can see rebirth in nature. You can eat all of the stalks of the celery, and if you put that core in water, it's going to sprout again. It's going to grow again. So this idea that we're just this one time only kind of recycled, I think our souls recycle. I think our spirits come back into whatever forms that they do, to whatever planets they do. But that I see the anima in us being much like water in a stream. And we're all together, these droplets of water are all together in this creative stream. And then as we're born, we go off the side of that cliff in that waterfall. And for just a brief instant, we're a droplet. we're an individual singular thing that somehow is separated from the stream of creation. And then we hit bottom at the end of our lives and we're back into that stream of creation again. So I don't think I'm just going to be a drop that hits the ground and somehow dries up. Who or what I become after this, I have no idea, because life is a great mystery. They often say that our consciousness is at the seat of our cerebral cortex. That's what neurologists would teach us to believe. And yet there was this neurologist who had a severe brain disease and he lost all consciousness in his cerebral cortex. And after 2 weeks, they were getting ready to pull the plug on him and he came back. And he went from being an atheist to being an absolute believer in life after life. So we do transition into something. What it is, I don't know. And where it goes from there, I don't know. It'll be very interesting.
Cool, thank you. Emily?
I guess I focused a bit different on like what comes to mind for me is in the cyclicism of not just life, but like the whole pattern of liberation. And it spoke to me like I get of a certain strain of Christian theology and realized eschatology. And I don't know how many terms I have to define here. It's probably quite a bit. Eschatology is basically Christian theology about the end of the world, basically your standard apocalypse stuff. But it has different ideas because it's like, it's how does God complete their grand scheme of redemption? And you can have a different one. You can have many different ways, including like your stereotypical God's going to end the world and rapture and all that. Realized eschatology says that it's already happened and it's going to keep happening. That what God did with Jesus' death and resurrection, it's not just that one time, like that's sort of like the story that we have, but the pattern happens again and again because we do keep needing to be liberated. The slaves were freed from Egypt, but the slaves were also freed from American plantations. Realized eschatology is huge in African American theology. The idea is that the cycle, the pattern keeps on going. God keeps doing what she does in the world, which is liberating. As far as like the individual soul, like, as I said, like, I really like to look at like the more grand scheme of history than focus on an individual salvation, more like collective liberation. But I see, for me personally, I see my part is like what I'm called to do is like to work for the liberation, and in that I will find my own personal liberation. As a white person, as a Christian, as a person of privilege, but also likewise as a trans person, as a woman, in the ways I am underprivileged. So in terms of life after death, for me personally, it's almost like a question I don't care that much about. I just have faith that that whatever it is in fact part of God's plan. So.
Thank you for that. So for those that don't know, we mentioned this person before, but there's some in the last panel, Dr. Cornel West, who is a prominent and provocative democratic intellectual, professor of philosophy, theology, author such as Race Matters, activist, all amazing things. This is an amazing human being who actually had a couple roles in The Matrix, being a council member and the elder in the first movie. Just really cool. And he's done commentaries on The Matrix too. But he when he was discussing The Matrix, he was talking about how Morpheus appears as an agent of awakening. It kind of relates to the earlier conversation we had before, but it became dogmatic, right? Later we find out that the faith he had was just another system of control, which we talked about. in terms of dogma, because oftentimes we feel that we're being liberated, right? But it's actually sometimes a false truth. How maybe it's the same question, but how do we recognize dogma? Because I think you alluded, Emily, to some of that, but maybe can you go a little bit deeper into what that actually looks like and differentiate, because it is about power in some ways.
I mean, for me, like the key test of like whether something's dogmatic is like, can it bear any sort of dissent or questioning or criticism? One of the things I found really interesting as a lens to look at the second and third movies is like, how does a community of the liberated act? And why does this community that has been liberated from a system of oppression have military ranks? Why does it have systems of authority and control within it? And the one council member, whose name I forget, you know, talked a bit about like still relying on machines, still needing to rely on these symbols of oppression and control just to defend themselves. And you do see this. I mean, like well, really in any community that tries to be a safe space, having to deal with the paradox of tolerance and you know, how much dissent and questioning are we going to allow before it gets taken advantage of and the community gets destroyed from without. But dogma, like, I think the difference between sort of like understanding when the systems are maybe necessary and when they just become dogmatic and are also for control is whether they can handle dissent. So I'm not quite sure I agree with Cornel West that Morpheus becomes too dogmatic. He becomes sort of entrenched in his beliefs, but I don't ever see him forcing them on other people. I do want to say I love Cornel West. I follow him on Twitter. He's great.
Marcus, any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, anytime we codify beliefs, it's a sticky wicket, because we can see that reality is malleable and our notion of reality is subjective, and even none of us can agree on what happens after we leave here. What's interesting about systems of control is even the machine had a ghost in it. So the machine, you know, the architect had the oracle. And maybe the oracle was set up to give out a false message ultimately, but in the end, it achieved the goal that was originally intended in that message, which was the liberation of people from this sense of you know, of non-reality, not living their lives. And I agree with Emily. It's a fascinating kind of truce that gets made in the end, where the architect still goes on, the matrix still goes on, people who can be there, and the people who are liberated are still relying upon the very mechanisms that oppress them, which are machines. So, you know, I'm interested in what the fourth installment has to say about reconciling that kind of sticky ending. And this is not to be critical of established religions, and I'm not picking on Christianity when I talk about.
Please do it. We deserve it.
Codifying beliefs, because Buddhists do it too. My father was Buddhist, and I studied a lot of Buddhism, and I have great respect for Buddhism as well. But when I started seeing them diagramming heaven, it kind of lost me. And when my stepmother, who is Vietnamese, would say to me, "Oh yes, in 30 days I'll be reborn," I'm like, well, a day is just, you know, a circle of this planet. It has no, time is just a measure of distance, really. So what is 30 days if you're a spirit?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure, you know, I think the more we can separate, I think our karma needs to run over our dogma.
Nice. Well, it's interesting when you were saying that because Einstein said something similar to what you're saying that we cannot solve the problems of the world using the same tools that created it in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is the guy who led us to splitting the atom in the nuclear age. So
Although he realized before they tested it, he was like, oh no, this is not gonna go well. And he tried to stop them, but it was a little bit too late.
Oppenheimer's famous words are, we are become the destroyer of worlds.
Mhm.
Quoting from the
Oh.
Tibetan Book of the Dead there. It's- actually, sorry, go on, Courtney.
No, that's okay. I am trying to think of a next question. So if you have another comment, go ahead.
I did, then I lost it. I think, yeah, when I was working in, I did inpatient spiritual care in a hospital, a mental health hospital. What I would often tell people is like, spirituality, whatever spirituality is, it's the core. It's the actual meaningful stuff, but it's hard to get a hold of. So religion, whatever our religious language is, the stories, the rituals, and the doctrines, and the dogmas, they can be useful sort of scaffolding or useful ways to give dimension to it, to spirituality, to make it more tangible, to make it more accessible to the individual. But when there are moments that when whatever we were using to like give it dimension, it becomes more of a barrier, then get rid of that. So, you know, you get hung up on an old doctrine or dogma that's really getting in the way of actually accessing the spirituality, get rid of it.
Mhm.
There, I just told you how I deal with Leviticus 18:22. It gets in the way of my relationship with God, so I ignore it.
You know, interesting enough, the Matrix was also an illusion, but it was an malleable illusion because, you know, Neo was flying around like Superman for a while there. So, and I lost my train of thought because I'm old. More coffee, please.
So you were
That ultimately it's back to the scaffolding, which I appreciate because ultimately there's this belief, and it's helpful to have a framework that we can use, you know, and Native American spirituality does not depart from that because we have ceremonies and traditions and things that are very carefully prescribed and followed. So I don't want to make it sound like human, you know, we're the only ones who don't do that stuff. We do it as well. We just don't write it down in books and tell people how to do it. That ultimately, I'm going to find it here somewhere, that I'll come back to it. I just can't find it.
okay, no worries. No worries. So one of the questions I think we'll probably have, I'll ask one or two more questions and then we'll move on to the audience asking some questions. One of the questions I wanted to ask is,
Sure.
in the world of the Matrix, and I think, Emily, you alluded to this in your original talk about being compared to a form of police state. Because of the fiction that is created, we keep each other in the illusion, and then we pull in those higher military or agents to reinforce when things get out of hand. In the US, we have the militarization of the police murders of Black Americans with little to no accountability or punishment. We have some of this with Indigenous people in Canada. We just had the invasion and police invading the Wet'suwet'en, apologies if I mispronounced that word, sovereign land, because they were basically land protectors, and they have sovereignty over their land in Canada. Because they were trying to block the pipeline. And so, of course, the police invaded it. We found out the NDP, who's supposed to be progressive, has been funneling more money to the pipelines than even the Liberals were. So they're supposed to be better. And here they are, in some ways, perpetuating not only discrimination, but environmental havoc on our world, right? And so what my question is, how do you, there's a comparison between the Matrix and this, and I'm wondering if you folks can speak to that to some degree.
Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to go first, Marcus, or?
Go ahead, Emily.
Okay. Random aside, BC NDP called me a week ago asking for money, and they both dead named me, and I blew up on them for both that and for the Wet'suwet'en, and said, please don't call me again. I think it's sort of a universal truth that I think we all know, and is that as it seems like there is progress, social progress in certain areas for social justice, there comes a strong backlash, and the backlash can be overwhelming. We do see this, again, drawing it back to transgender liberation, with a lot of the the bills introduced in the United States concerning youth participation in sports being sort of identified as like, oh, we're the we are the culture war issue du jour, because maybe progress marches on. But I think my personal feeling is I don't think we're any nearer or further away from a police state than we have ever been. In certain areas, we are becoming more aware of it, but this has always happened. And it does, I think it's good if it's trying to, if it does damage to the liberal myth of progress, that, society is just always getting better and we're always on the right track. Because that's not true. As I said, it's sort of like cyclical. We're always in need of liberation. There is always something else going on. Power will shift. Systems of oppression will shift their focus based on, what they think is what those systems think might think is the weak points, or where there's the most opportunity. So it's really hard not to look at the world and think it's getting worse. I don't think it's getting worse. I don't think it's getting better. I think it's just things are changing, and that's sort of like it's sort of like what was present up until Neo made his choice at the end of the second movie, which is like this continual just sort of like cycle and struggle that never ever seems to end. And there's still the ambiguity when the architect asks the Oracle, how long is this going to last? And she's like, eh.
Mm-hmm. Marcus.
Well, I'm making some notes here because it's a subjective reality. So whether or not you live in a police state depends on whether or not the cop is your friend or not. So when you come from communities that are afraid to call the police when domestic violence or rape is going on, or even being attacked or carjacked because you're going to be under suspicion, the cop is not your friend. When you're Tamir Rice, who gets shot for having a toy gun, the cop is not your friend. When you're Kyle Rittenhouse, who can kill 3 people, walk down the street with an AK-47 and be absolved of those murders because he's a white boy, you better believe that we live in a police state. And if you look at the Capitol insurrection, if you looked at the failed coup that happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. in the US, it was a starkly different reaction to what it was 10 days earlier when Black Lives Matter came to peacefully protest, and they had armed riot guards and I mean military everything out there for a very peaceful protest. But when a bunch of white people want to take over that Capitol, suddenly we can't do anything about it. And to be fair, those Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police fought their butts off for hours to keep people from making this incursion. But I'm just saying, there speaks to the privilege of what is a police state and what is not a police state. And if you feel so confident that you can march up to the Capitol with a gun in your pocket and break down the door and go inside and think nobody's going to be on you for that, you know, the police is your friend. So I think, as I see the US going to increase militarization of the police and looking at this idea of changing funding, I'm not saying defunding, because I want bad people put away too. I've been raped. I don't want rapists walking around. I think that when there's such a pushback on putting more money into social care or mental health care or any other things that cops don't really need to have to be dealing with other than really violent people, then, you know, that says to me we live in a police state. When the NRA has more influence than the PTA in terms of policy reckoning, we live in a police state. And I just can't be convinced otherwise. When they turn water hoses on Native American people on their own land in South Dakota for trying to defend a river against a black snake of oil, we live in a police state. I'm a little bit passionate about that. Me and Cornel West, we kind of like this.
Yes. Thank you for that, both of you. It's good to have, you know, throughout these conversations, it's always interesting, you know, where folks align and where they differ and, you know, all of that. And that's why we do this, because we want to hear the multiplicity of voices that exist on these issues and the complexity, because they're not simple or binary, you know, it's certainly not that, right? So maybe what I want to do before we move in the Q&A is maybe if you folks want to have anything closing that you want to say before we shift off into the audience to say anything. Emily.
Not a whole lot. I do want to say how honored and privileged I am to share this panel with Marcus and really hear his wisdom, and just so appreciative of that. Been appreciative of the comments I've seen in the chat. Haven't leaned over to discuss them, but I'll probably get to them in a sec. And just a real appreciation for being able to be here as I am and who I am.
Thank you. Marcus.
I would say, Emily, that the privilege and the pleasure is mine as well. It's been a very thoughtful conversation, and I agree with Corey. I think if we were all on the same page about everything, it would be kind of a bland discussion. So hearing spirited points of view is always a beautiful thing. I just want to end with this thought that I was trying to remember earlier, and that's that human beings are incredibly uncomfortable with uncertainty. And that would be something that would drive Cypher back into the matrix again, because the world on the outside was too uncertain. He knew what he could, you know, and he was going to be made, I don't know, a movie star, slightly rich. You know, so he knew what he could expect there. But this idea that we don't know where we go when we die, we don't know where we came from before we were born. Some of us don't know where our next meal is coming from or where we're going to sleep that night. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And I think that the beauty that spirituality, whatever we want to call it, brings to people is kind of kind of permission, like it's okay that you feel uncertain. It's okay that you have questions. This is as old as human beings. The minute we looked up at the stars and said, wow, what is that? And how did I get here? So finding ways to soften a harsh world through getting rid of the edge of uncertainty is an understandable pursuit. And we won't know until this ride is over. And maybe we all go off to our own separate realities in the world after this. I don't know, but I'm just willing to bet that life and creation is a beautiful, beautiful thing. You only have to look at this planet. You only have to look at pictures of the stars and nebulas and just the amazing amount of creation that goes on there that is so much larger than anything that we can possibly imagine. So when you feel uncertain, just remind yourself that the planets spin with great precision and that the seasons come and the seasons go, and that you can count on. And everything has a birth and everything has a death, and that includes the stars.
Nice. That's beautiful to end on. So what I want to know, Nicola, do we have any questions coming from our amazing audience members?
I don't see any questions at the moment, no.
Okay, so we'll give it a couple minutes, but please type it in if you have any questions, maybe your comments. I know wonderful Daryl has been commenting probably this whole conversation, which is amazing. And yes, and I think Annie commented a little bit. So yeah, just if you have any questions, type them in. Let's see if, okay, so Daryl types Joe Pantoliano. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. What it says, what a method actor. His line, I want to be someone important, like an actor. The compounding of Joe and his character Cypher arrogance in the moment helps the movie's theme hammer home. So yeah, just reinforcing what you were saying, Marcus. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think there's definitely a lot of I think there's a lot of Sissy Nipan peep sort of things going on with this movie, like little things like that break the fourth wall, that remind you you are in fact watching a simulated reality. Even the quote unquote reality is still a simulated reality because it's a film.
Mm-hmm.
I adore the acting in this movie. I know Keanu Reeves's acting became a bit of a meme, a bit of a joke. Okay, so this is just a completely off the wall different story, but one of my creative writing professors actually went to high school with Keanu Reeves and was in drama club with him. And she would tell us a little bit about like what she thought went on with The Matrix was just, I have a different theory, like knowing about the whole trans metaphor and what Keanu himself has said on the part, but like at the time it was like, you know, prior to The Matrix, he was known for Bill and Ted and just like wanting to not be typecast in that. But, you know, Neo is coded as a trans character, that emotional deadness, kind of spot on. And then every moment, and you know, I really empathize with the whoa all the time, a lot of the time. So I think Keanu Reeves' acting is actually spot on. I think until maybe there's a few in like the Zion scenes where I'm not too impressed with a lot of the actors, but overall among the main characters, the acting in these movies is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love the acting. I have to say, just from a critical point of view about movies, the writing started to fall apart in the third episode just a bit, because there were some cheesy lines where Nan and I looked at each other and said, oh, how did they say that with conviction? It's really, really bad. I think that I've seen Keanu Reeves act in many different things, and he's a brilliant actor. He really is, and he's a decent human being. But I think that his character was intentionally flat, and people read that as bad acting when indeed it's actually good acting. It's really hard for a really good singer to sing bad, and when a good singer can sound like they're tone deaf, that's some good acting.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, the writing could be a bit off. I think I wrote down in my notes, okay, spoiler alert, because I know you're watching the third movie next week, so I don't know if anyone was watching for that for the first time, but I've been saying estrogen's got me crying at a lot of sad scenes. I did not cry when Trinity died. I had a hard time actually feeling that scene. And I'm like, why aren't I crying? I cry at everything now.
I had the same reaction when I said, and I was like, oh God, don't tell me he's gonna, oh, he's kissing her dead lips. Oh. Sorry, spoiler alert. The thing that got to me was, and this happens in American movies, and I just wish they ditched this tripe, is the obligatory sex scenes. The obligatory love interest. Like I'm not sex negative. So I just want to put that out there. I'm actually very sex positive. But I found like the whole quasi orgy scene in the Zion to be a bit over the top. And then of course, you know, Neo and Trinity have to sneak off for a passionate whatever. And it's like, you know, you're kind of distracting me from the storyline here. So I could go to Pornhub if I want to watch orgies, but indeed I was more into science fiction at that moment.
Yeah, it's especially in contrast to the first movie, which is extremely sterile.
Right.
Very chaste. Those human moments of like who are the sexy characters? There's the White Rabbit lady, and then there's the woman in red. And you know, Neo responds to neither of them. Neo and Trinity are both like very androgynous, and they're not really sexed up. Although Carrie-Anne Moss is extremely attractive, and so is Keanu Reeves. And then the second movie, you know, suddenly it's an explosion of sexuality. I found a little bit of resonance in that in the trans woman experience, because when you first go on HRT, generally, and this is not everybody's experience, but the general experience is getting your testosterone cut off just crashes your sex drive, and you become thoroughly uninterested in it until your estrogen has a chance to regulate itself, or you go onto progesterone, and then it slowly comes back, but it comes back in a different way. So as soon as Neo is liberated, the first time he takes that red pill, it's like that complete part of him is gone. Just a thought, just an interesting parallel I found.
No, that's fascinating, because it's the opposite is true. When you start testosterone, you turn from a middle-aged woman into a teenage boy. And, you know, my poor girlfriend at the time, that's all I got to say. She has since become my wife, but I had to do some growing up.
No, that was definitely my husband's experience as well.
Yes, our interesting experiencing with second, and in my case, I've had third puberty. So yes, the adventures along those lines are immense. Annie says, more of a curiosity than an actual question related to my Kabbalah comment above. Then you have a religion that at one point recognizes more than simply binary gender, officially stops recognizing that. How do we go about accepting ourselves even before accepting others? Really good question. Who would like to comment on that?
I can't specifically say I know a lot about Kabbalah. I can speak to from, you know, a sort of Christian / Jewish perspective overall. You know, you'll get different answers from, of course, different Christians, and then that's one of the big things. Is like there's no monolithic Christian theology. But, and I mean that's true of every religion. There's a sort of perception that, you know, oh, the gender binary was instituted, it was ordained by God, male and female, he created them. And it is true that does come up other places in the Bible. Paul, in particular, in 1 Corinthians 11, goes off about it in an extremely patriarchal way. But one of the most wonderful things I've heard, I think, for non-binary peoples in terms of like the creation story, God created male and female. God also created day and night, but there is twilight and there is dawn. There is the blending between the two. So, I mean, how do we go about accepting ourselves before accepting others is, I know that's a big question, and a lot of people have struggled with it. And ultimately they, I know I struggle with it still quite a bit. A lot of questions about, you know, why am I like this? How could I possibly be like this? But acceptance isn't about, I don't want to say this. I try to look at like what I might say is a more Buddhist idea of acceptance. It's just like I can hold, or what Marcus was saying about, like, you know, being able to be okay with uncertainty of the questions. I can hold that question and I can learn to be okay with not having an answer.
Marcus, what is your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because not all belief systems are gendered binary. And there's a lot of Native American stories that talk about more than one gender. And in fact, Aristotle had an idea of there being 3 genders, male and male-female in between. I think the Dene people have 5 genders in their, and a part of their creation story, and forgive me to my Dene friends if I'm getting this wrong, involves a person of a spirit of indeterminate gender that helped bring the world to be. So if it weren't for trans people, there wouldn't be a world in that idea. It's when you get into religions that have been mostly westernized or codified that it becomes a problem, especially those that tend to deal with a patriarchal point of view. And the Native American world, by and large, is matrilinear. We tend to follow more through the mother's lines and not trace things through the father's lines. And it's the mothers and the aunties who are the teachers and who are actually the leaders. So, so there's a much more gender expansive idea than just Judeo-Christian idea of the creation of the world. Self-acceptance, you can't, until you accept yourself, until you love yourself, until you know yourself, you can't love, know, accept anything else around you. And everything comes from self-love. And as a person who spent 37 years in the wrong gender, I had a lot of I despised myself a lot. Really didn't understand why people loved me as much as they did, because I surely must have been some broken, messed up thing. And I remember one night counting to myself, how many friends could I call in the middle of the night and ask for help? And when I got past 4 dozen, I thought to myself, well, if this many people love me, then there must be something lovable here, and I'm going to act as if. So sometimes when it comes to self-acceptance and understanding yourself and learning about yourself, you have to act as if it's okay. You have to just, just take on that whatever you're feeling, whatever you're coming to know in yourself, that's okay. And it's not dependent upon being validated by anybody else but you, because you are your own creator. You are the master and mistress and commander of your own universe, and you get to decide who you are. And I'm all about fighting for the rights of people who don't pass, who don't fit in, who never will. Because until the world is safe for all of us, it's not safe for any of us. And the reality is that hundreds of trans women get killed globally every year because other people are transphobic. So, it begins with yourself and learning to love yourself and letting that spread outward. So act as if you're okay. Act as if who you believe yourself to be is okay. And you can start moving out into the community and sharing that love.
Thank you, Marcus. So I want to jump in to answer this question, because as a therapist, I have a little bit of background on the latter part of that, and I've done my own research on Kabbalah. And so in the Kabbalah, there is a story about before Adam and Eve, there was the Adam, right? And the Adam was an androgynous being on a higher energy consciousness level. This was supposed to be the model for humanity. And then God decided to split them into two halves, male and female, right? And so that's a story within Kabbalah. Again, like Emily has said, not everyone agrees with that or acknowledges that as part of the history or that kind of thing. But that is something that it is there as well. And I think Emily, Jane was saying that there's something similar within Christianity too, but I can't remember what the story she was talking about.
Sorry, I'm reading through the chat. I guess I can't think of a specific story that might echo with that, but one of the things I felt is like, to me, the gender binary is actually part of original sin. Adam and Eve were together in the garden, both made in the image of God. And then it was only when they ate the fruit that they realized they were naked. And then suddenly, I assume, realized that they had different bodies, that there was a difference between them, and decided to make all sorts of assumptions based on those differences. And there we get the first assigned male and the first assigned female. But that's part of the brokenness. That was part of the fall. So to me, the gender binary isn't ordained by God. It's sin, basically. It's something we did.
Fascinating. I hadn't heard that interpretation, but it's kind of neat.
Maybe unique to me, I don't know. I'll talk to some other trans ministers and see what they think about it.
Gender is a social construct that changes from group to group. And what's perceived as masculine in downtown USA is very different than Mexico or Thailand or Native America or any other place. So this idea that what we see gender to be here in Canada and the US to be how they envisioned gender to be thousands of years ago when writing these books, and what their intentions were for prescribing these gendered roles to people. It's just a different way of looking at things. And in my mind, it became a tool of control.
And it's extremely arbitrary. Like, for me, I find heels very euphoric. I love them, but they were originally designed as men's shoes to be able for riding. Acknowledging that gender is a social construct, but like, I can say for myself, I still want to be within it. I am a binary trans woman. I want to be seen as female. And there are a lot of things. So like, I will make those performances. I will perform female for the sake of being seen as female. So I'm not saying that I'm above the gender binary. I'm still definitely within it. I just decided I wanted to play for the other team.
You know, I don't see so much as gender as these two little discrete boxes that are separate from each other. I think they're intimate. And in fact, I think it's actually a spectrum, and that all of us fall within this spectrum somewhere, whether it's on the binary ends or somewhere in the middle. As a two-spirit person, I often say that I'm the absolute embodiment of male and female spirit. And as a transgender person, I can absolutely say that I'm a physical embodiment of masculine and feminine. So, you know, I don't think anyone should put you at fault, Emily, for being a fully identified binary female any more than I would fault someone for being somewhere in the middle. You know, we all get to choose who we get to be, and that's okay. I got tired of getting stink eye when people saw me only as a binary male. You know, I had to like come and appreciate what the non-binary movement was about, but realizing that I've been a part of transgender politics since 1994 and seeing the evolution of how it's changed in my lifetime. When I was younger, you weren't even allowed to be homosexual. So if I said that I was going to be with men after transition, they would not allow me to transition because we were all supposed to turn out to be happy heterosexuals. So there's a weird way that the superimposition of other people's idea of gender role expectation gets foisted upon those of us who medically or socially transition into a binary role. I got called she today by somebody standing behind me at the grocery store. And even with a COVID mask on, there's not much she going on here that anybody could read. So I just wonder, you know, what it was. But I cease to worry about it anymore, unless somebody is wanting to punch me or spit on me. I'm okay if they misgender me now and then.
Mhm. So to jump back to the question of connecting with self and loving self before you can love others, I think there's a few different things. I think it is about like finding folks within your community that support you as you are, that see you at who you are and honors that, right? And they may be someone who's trying to be an ally, may not always get it, but it's really there for you and all of those things. I think that's really important to say, because when folks are starting, there is like this whole questioning of everything, like their whole sometimes self-esteem goes down, and it's like, is this valid? Am I sick? A lot of those questions can come up. So if you have folks that can reinforce, hey, this is valid, right? But also we live in a time where we can, you know, we had our first transgender superhero just recently, right? Daryl just noted that there's a trans Doctor Who, right? We have these representations now that can reinforce. We can find groups across the globe, probably minus a few places like maybe China or something, that has places where you can connect online with other people and ask questions. So ask questions, let yourself know that, you know, this is a valid thing. And then even then, when you know it's valid, there is still this questioning because there's so much programming that this is wrong, you're sinful, or whatever the case may be. And then it's a work in progress. It's a slow process to really go inside and let yourself deprogram yourself and know that you are amazing for who you are. And that may include seeing a spiritual teacher who honors you, going to see a therapist, a mentor, whatever the case, and working with that person to tell you, to help you connect and honor and really love that self, right? And I will also say, I think self-love is a broad experience the lack of self-love across. It's not just a trans, although we definitely experience lack of it at times, but everyone has that at times. And so really stepping into that and knowing that we are beautiful no matter where we are, and that even if we make mistakes or we don't fit into the culture, we are valuable, and know that, right? And know it's a process too, right? When I was first trying to help, I was in Red Deer at the time and starting the first LGBTQ youth agency. And I had pulled in a binary trans woman. And at the time, there was only 3 of us out, me, non-binary, and 2 other binary trans. And they were like non-acknowledging non-binary folks. And so when I had pulled this person in to talk to this youth, I had asked, like, where do you fit on the spectrum? And afterwards, the person came to me and was flipping out, like, why did you're going to confuse this person? And as it was already said, confusion is part of the process, right? Acknowledge that confusion is part of the process, and it's not fun, but it is what it is, right? So yeah, I just want to say that. Daryl says, my new age teaching tells the story of the creation of our reality, and the foundation is the splitting of God into male and female, good and evil concepts. And the wisdom is learning as creation reconciles those differences and rejoins to return to God with experience and understanding of self. So, yeah. Annie says, I agree with Auntie Kate somewhat. I'm not a man, not fully a woman. Life would be simpler if I could honestly say I was 100% one or the other. Yeah.
I mean, to a degree that I think that's true for a lot of us. And labels are always going to be simplifications. Like, I'm calling myself a binary trans woman, but I would not say I would identify like 100%. I'm feeling more and more like that's just the label that feels most comfortable for me. I mean, likewise, sexuality is like, I will tell you that coming at as trans and then trying to like understand where is my sexuality now has been a ride. Straight, I don't want to be straight. I thought I wasn't straight. I didn't think I was this boring. Sorry, that's been my joke to try and deal with that.
I think we're kind of trapped in this illusion of either or. And it's why I often don't use the word bisexual, even though politically and practically I am bisexual. I'm attracted to all genders. But I think that we've created this notion that things are either evil or good. And there are many shades of gray in between all of that, that things are either right or wrong. And there's many shades of gray in all of that. And likewise, I think in terms of expressing our gender, there is no right or wrong way to be. And that's what I want to tell everybody out there. It would be easier if one felt binary. I'm sure that for Corey, the world is a difficult place, harder for Corey to navigate than it is for me, because I am binary. And I don't have to correct people on pronouns, even when they call me she, whatever. But I just want to say that only you know who you are, and nobody can tell you that. And what you need to do is surround yourself with people who will affirm that. Mm-hmm. That you get to decide. You are the architect of your life. And if you were to die tomorrow, would you want to die feeling unfinished, uncertain, or would you want to be at some kind of peace? And so I always say to folks, find peace wherever you're at, even if that is on a journey point, because we're all on a journey point. Mm-hmm. Life is not a destination, it's a journey. So enjoy the ride, experience the uncertainty, grow and learn from that, because that will make you stronger in knowing who you really are.
Thank you for that. I think it's 3:54. Unless there's anything really quick that either of you want to say, I think we'll want to close things up.
I just saw that Annie posted a link and I wanted to very quickly actually respond with a really interesting link I found for kind of along those same lines, about like reading queerness in the Torah. So just reading Joseph and the story of Joseph as genderqueer is a really interesting sort of Jewish midrash into that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I
Marcus?
wanted to thank all of the participants who were sitting here listening, who were joining in the conversation via chat, who made this all possible, because this is a wonderful conversation. I rarely get to delve so deeply down the rabbit hole with folks, and to share it with so many people was a wonderful experience, to be sure. And I just want to say that science fiction is full of lots of stories, whether it's the War of the Worlds or, just so many stories where humans are seen as the virus and the problem. And I wonder how much that intrudes into our own thinking about our own self-worth. And I want to say that we are not a virus on this planet. We are not a problem, but we need to be a part of the solution.
Cool. That's beautiful. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. So what I'm going to say is, as we close things up, I'm going to be available for about an hour to about 5 o'clock. So if folks want to hang out, chat, because I know that when we've done other events, that is a need that sometimes come up for folks. So I'll be available. People want to skedaddle, that is totally cool as well. If you folks really enjoyed this conversation, definitely check out next week's, because as I said, it's going to be Buddhism, neurology, and physics. But also I'm hoping at some point I'm going to be putting together a series of conversations on spirituality and gender diversity. I'm not sure if it's going to be research related, but that is something I really want to demystify and talk about the strengths. And so we'll be able to get into some of these conversations even deeper. I'm not sure when that will happen, but that is kind of in the planning stage. So if you folks are really enjoyed this kind of conversation and like going down in this way and learning from different faiths, or maybe try and figure out where you fit, this may be a great thing for you. So definitely, if you have ideas or suggestions or want to be involved in that, and somehow, I think my email was shared earlier, so definitely contact me. I think I'm going to shut up now and pass the torch on to Emily. And yeah, and I should say thank you to Marcus and Emily for being our panelists. You were amazing. Again, we had such a deep conversation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Emily.
I also wanted to extend my deepest appreciation to our panelists from today. It was absolutely amazing to sit here and have the opportunity to hear the conversation. It was super informative and definitely some interesting points that I had not considered. Corey had already mentioned this, but I did just want to reiterate that on December 18th at 11 a.m., there will be a watch party for Matrix Revolution. And then from 2 to 4 p.m., the panel, which will be the theme of science. Again, Corey has mentioned this, but it will be Bruno, Elisa, and I'm so sorry if I pronounce this wrong, but Goncalves D'Andrade, who is a neuroscience, teaches neuroscience and the philosophy of science from Brazil. Dr. Pete, who is a physicist from the University of Toronto. Then on December 29th, we will have our watch party from 7 to 9 p.m. of the Matrix Resurrections. And then our final panel will follow on December 30th from 2 to 4 p.m. I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you there and look forward to that conversation for sure.